On November 13, 2022, a brutal crime shocked the small town of Moscow, Idaho. 4 University of Idaho students were murdered in their off-campus home, sparking a wave of fear, speculation, and investigation. This case stunned the nation, leaving questions that remain unanswered, and families who will never heal. Watch as we unravel the mystery behind the murders, the chilling silence of the killer, and how justice is unfolding. Stay tuned as we dive into the timeline of the murders and what happened that fateful night, the investigation that led to Kohberger's arrest, the unanswered questions about the killer's motives, the emotional aftermath, and the quest for justice. Subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. If you have any thoughts on the case or questions about the investigation, let us know in the comments below. This is a case that shook the world. Join the discussion. It was a small college town, tucked between quiet hills and pine trees, Moscow, Idaho. Cold air sliding off the mountains that night. The kind of stillness that holds its breath before something breaks. Inside a 3-story house on King Road, 4 students were home. Laughter earlier in the evening. Music, lights glowing faintly through the kitchen blinds. It was a weekend like many before. Nothing that should have been remembered beyond sunrise. But somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, someone moved through the shadows of that house. Quiet steps, a gloved hand on a doorknob, a knife carried like a secret. No one in the neighborhood heard a scream. The wind carried everything away. By dawn, the sky had turned silver and cold. A friend came by, then another. Calls were made to phones that never answered. Police arrived just before noon. The house felt heavy, windows closed, doors slightly ajar. Inside were scenes that even trained officers struggled to describe. 4 students gone, each in a different room, each caught in a moment that should never have happened. The news spread faster than anyone could process. A town that rarely saw anything beyond parking tickets now swarmed with flashing lights. Crime scene tape, reporters, neighbors whispering over fences. People said the air changed that day, that the wind itself grew cautious. King Road became more than a street. It became a line drawn between before and after. Detectives began marking the floors. Photographers whispered coordinates. The chief of police stood outside his car for a long time, staring at the windows. Every few seconds, his radio hissed. Every few seconds, another officer walked out with eyes that refused to meet his. The victims were young, bright faces on social feeds now frozen in time. Friends, roommates, people whose only crime was living in the same house. By nightfall, candles began appearing on the campus steps. Names written on paper bags glowing from within. Students walked past quietly. No one spoke loudly. Everyone looked at each other with the same question in their eyes. Who could walk into a home full of life and leave it silent? The coroner's van pulled away under police escort. Snow started to fall light as dust. A professor watching from across the street whispered, "It feels like the world tilted a little." And somewhere in that same town, someone walked home, maybe washed their hands, maybe slept like nothing had happened, while 4 families across the country waited for calls that would never come. The night ended, but the story had only begun. Morning found the town staring at a house that did not blink. Frost clung to car roofs like a thin veil. Students shuffled past with coffee cups and wide, quiet eyes. Sirens drifted and faded and drifted again. Yellow tape cut the yard into pieces the way fear cuts a day into hours. Phones lit with messages that had no answers. "Are you safe? Please call me. Where are you?" Screens filled with names that should have been in class by noon. Professors opened doors and met empty chairs and deeper silence. Neighbors spoke softly by the sidewalk and pointed to the windows. They said they slept through everything. They said the night was ordinary until it was not. They watched officers enter with gloves and masks and the careful steps of people who understand weight. They watched other officers stand still with hands on their belts and eyes on the ground. Inside, the air felt stale from heaters and shock. First responders moved with a rhythm that tried to be gentle. Evidence markers bloomed across floors like a field of small yellow flowers. Laces dragged softly. Camera shutters clicked like distant rain. Detectives traced a path from the backsliding door to the stairs. They paused at each hinge and handle and shadow. They listened to the quiet like it might confess. They spoke in low voices about timelines and roots and the shape of a life when it collides with evil. The coroner arrived wrapped in a winter coat that seemed too thin for the moment. She nodded to the chief and climbed the steps with practiced sorrow. Downstairs, an officer held his notebook as if it might steady his hands. He wrote the date slowly and underlined it once, as if ink could anchor reality to paper. Across campus, an email went out with careful words. There has been an incident. Stay aware. Support services are available. Some students packed bags and drove home without telling anyone. Others gathered in clusters and made plans to sleep in groups. No one wanted to be alone. Not that night, not after this. Reporters set up across the street and adjusted tripods with gloved fingers. They rehearsed sentences that felt too smooth for the rawness nearby. Neighbors learned to walk around cables and microphones. They learned to keep their voices low to avoid becoming part of the story. Parents called constantly. Some begged their children to come home. Some just wanted to hear breathing on the other end. A mother at a gas station stared at the pump and whispered, "Be careful, be careful, be careful." She did not realize the words were out loud until a stranger answered, "I will." By afternoon, the chief stepped to a makeshift podium. He thanked the community for patience and asked for tips. He did not speculate. He did not point. He promised presence and patrols and the slow, stubborn grind of work. Behind him, the house stood like a closed book with torn pages. In the evidence room, bag after bag received its label. Fibers and tape and traces that would be dust to anyone but a lab. A single hair sealed in plastic. A footprint photographed before the sun could shift it. A pattern that meant nothing yet and everything later. Candlelight returned to the campus steps as the sky turned the color of steel. Names shone through paper like constellations pulled down to earth. Someone played a soft song from a phone held against a coat. People cried without wiping their faces. They let the cold do that for them. Night fell again and patrol cars cruised past every few minutes. Officers rolled windows down to feel the air. They told one another it would break soon. A lead, a clue, a call. They said it to stay warm inside their chests. Somewhere a person watched the news in a dark room. The screen flickered blue across a wall and a hand and a face that stayed off camera. Maybe footsteps tapped a nervous rhythm on a floor. Maybe the room was quiet enough to hear a heart. The house on King Road kept its stillness. The town tried to sleep anyway, and the investigation took its first long, careful breath. The day stretched out like a quiet river. There was no noise but the sound of shoes on wet pavement and coffee cups that never seemed full. Officers knocked on doors, interviewed friends, mapped every movement, every phone call, every class schedule. But the answers never came quickly, not in the way they needed them to. The house was locked down, but the world was not. Students returned to classes unsure if they should show their faces. A town that lived on familiarity now wondered who they had lived beside. Every face became a question. Every new stranger on the street felt like a potential answer to a question no one had asked. The killer was still somewhere. Still breathing somewhere? The quiet seemed to hum louder when the sun went down. Detectives pulled the victims' phones from evidence and ran the numbers one by one. Calls to friends, to family, to people who were far away and had no idea their names would soon be part of a murder investigation. Each call had a time, a location, a silence. A breakthrough came when a student reported seeing a white Hyundai Elantra parked too long by the house on King Road the night of the killings. They'd seen the car parked across the street earlier in the evening. They didn't think much of it until they saw it again at 3 a.m., sitting there just outside the reach of streetlights. Quiet, still. The car wasn't much to go on, but it was something. They called in every Hyundai Elantra owner in the area. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack made of similar needles. Hundreds of them, but something about the timing made it different. Someone was watching and they had no idea who it was yet. Police began canvassing the area for surveillance footage. They called businesses and asked for security tapes. Each piece that came back felt like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. But the Hyundai stuck out. The car was captured again just before 4 a.m., turning slowly down a side road away from King Road. At the same time, a suspect list began forming. It wasn't a list of names yet, just a sense that the killer was someone who knew the area, someone who knew how to move quietly in the night, someone who knew how to disappear in plain sight. By the end of the week, police had a name: Bryan Kohberger. a 28-year-old PhD student at Washington State University, just over 10 miles from the scene of the crime. The name didn't mean much at first, but the connection was undeniable. The Hyundai Elantra matched, the timeline fit, and the face in the photo seemed to belong to a man who could vanish into the crowd of any college campus. They started to dig deeper. His history, his friends, his life at WSU. Nothing unusual on the surface, nothing that screamed danger or crime. But there was something about the way he moved when asked about his schedule. Something about the way he seemed too eager to help when he was interviewed. Something that made officers pause before letting him walk away. And then the DNA came. A single trace left in the house. Too small to see by the naked eye, but big enough to tie him to the scene. The pattern started to come into view. The suspect was calm. Too calm? He said nothing when they asked about the murders. He answered questions with precise words and stiff movements. He denied knowing anything about the killings. He denied ever visiting King Road. But the truth was catching up. The Elantra had been traced to his apartment. The phone records were being matched. And the DNA would not lie. The community held its breath. The trial was coming. But not yet. Not today. Not tomorrow. Bryan Kohberger was the name they would remember. But they wouldn't know what it meant just yet. The night was quiet. Too quiet for anyone to believe this was the beginning of the end. Officers had the name now. Bryan Kohberger. But they needed the car. The Hyundai Elantra. They had traced it to his apartment. But the car itself was still missing. It wasn't just any car. It was the piece of the puzzle that made the case whole. They needed to find it. Because they knew it would bring everything together. The way a single thread can pull a whole sweater apart. Investigators began combing through traffic cameras. The Elantra had been in plain sight for days, but no one had noticed it. Not until now. They tracked it through streetlights and shadows, through intersections and turns, all the way to the Idaho border. The car appeared again on a surveillance camera near Moscow, a faint outline passing under the street lamp. No one could see who was driving, but the car had the same unmistakable shape, the same color, the same make and model. The investigation exploded outward. What started as a missing piece now became the thread that unraveled everything. The Hyundai was everything. It was the bridge between the killer and the scene. It was the only constant that moved through the timeline without stopping. By the time the car was located, it had crossed state lines and made its way to Pullman, Washington. Kohberger's apartment complex was not far from the university, and the car sat parked outside in the same spot it had been days earlier. Parked like nothing had happened. Parked like it belonged there. They had no choice but to bring in the suspect. They called for a warrant. It was time to move. The car was the key, and they knew the arrest would be soon. Kohberger was still oblivious, still walking through his routine. The authorities were waiting for the right moment, for the right reason to pull him in. By the time they got the warrant, everything was in place. The pieces were coming together too fast for him to stop it. He had become a man walking through a storm without realizing the sky had already cracked open. The arrest was quiet. No sirens blared. No cameras flashed. They moved in fast. A small team of officers outside his apartment. A knock on the door. He answered it calmly. He was polite as they asked him to step outside. He did not resist. He did not ask questions. He simply walked out into the cold night air. And the world behind him began to change forever. Kohberger was taken into custody without incident, handcuffed and led away. He did not speak. He did not fight. The only sound was the rustling of his coat and the shuffle of boots on wet asphalt. Back in the precinct, the car was searched. Every inch of it carefully examined. They found traces of blood that had not yet dried. They found hair that wasn't his. They found pieces of the victim scattered among the seats and in the trunk. A map of Moscow. A notebook filled with strange notes. A pattern that could not be ignored. It was the moment the investigation turned its corner. The pieces they had gathered in silence for weeks now stood in front of them. The truth was no longer a theory. It was a reality they would soon face head-on. The air in the lab felt heavy. Machines hummed in the background. But all the noise fell away as the technician pulled the results from the machine. The DNA. It had been waiting there all along, hidden in plain sight. A small trace. A single sample that held the key to everything. In the weeks before, investigators had gathered scraps of evidence from the scene. hair fibers, blood droplets, a footprint that was barely visible. But the DNA had been the one thing they knew would tie it all together. The one thing that could prove what they had suspected all along. It wasn't just the car that linked Kohberger to the crime. It wasn't just the phone records or the surveillance footage. It was the DNA, the piece of the puzzle that made everything clear. The technician ran the sample through the process again, double-checking, triple-checking. This time it was undeniable. The match was perfect. It was his. Bryan Kohberger's DNA, the trace left behind on the victim's skin. The same DNA found on the knife sheath recovered from the crime scene. The same DNA that now confirmed everything the detectives had been working toward. The room fell silent. The team exchanged looks. There was no more doubt. There was no more room for speculation. They had their man. The breakthrough came at a time when everything felt like it was slipping through their fingers. Weeks of uncertainty. The long wait for a break in the case. But the DNA had arrived at the perfect moment. It had finally spoken. The news was swift. Law enforcement sent the results to the prosecutors. The district attorney stood at a podium later that day, announcing the DNA match to the world. It was no longer a theory or a guess. It was fact. Bryan Kohberger was the one who had killed those students in cold blood. But the DNA also raised more questions. How had he been able to leave such a small trace behind? What had led him to make that mistake? Had he thought he would get away with it? The lab results were sent to the defense team. They had to know. It was time to prepare for the inevitable. But Kohberger himself remained silent. Even when faced with the damning evidence, he said nothing. He simply stared. The prosecutor's office began preparing for trial. Witnesses were contacted. Evidence was organized. The trial date loomed ahead. But still, Kohberger remained a mystery. A man who had entered the world of academia, only to leave it behind for something darker. A man who now found himself at the center of a case that would forever change his life. And in the small town of Moscow, the survivors remained in a quiet grief. The families who had lost so much, the friends who had been left behind, the school that would never feel the same. The DNA trail had led them to a man, but it could never bring back what was lost. The morning came quietly in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Cold air carried through the trees like a warning. It was early still, too early for the world to be awake. But the officers were already out, their boots scraping against the damp pavement, the blue lights of unmarked cars flickering through the quiet. They had been waiting for this moment for days, months. It had taken longer than they thought, but it was time. Bryan Kohberger's arrest was the next chapter in a case that had stretched across state lines, through DNA matches, through cell phone records, through surveillance footage. Now it would culminate in a small house tucked away in the woods. There was no surprise in Kohberger's eyes when the door opened. He knew they were coming. He had always known the end would come one day. But in that moment he stood still, calm. He didn't flinch when the officers entered. He didn't argue when they told him to step outside. It was the middle of the night, the sky still dark with the weight of waiting. The world outside his house had no idea what was about to happen, but inside it was quiet, except for the sound of his voice answering their questions without hesitation. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He simply followed their instructions as they placed the handcuffs around his wrists. By the time they led him to the car, the news had already reached Moscow. The confirmation had come through. Bryan Kohberger had been taken into custody. The long wait was over. The killer who had walked among them for so long was finally in the hands of the law. But there was something unsettling about the arrest. The way he moved so calmly. The way he seemed almost detached from the reality of what had just happened, as if the weight of the moment hadn't fully reached him yet. The officers didn't say much as they loaded him into the car. They didn't need to. Everything had already been said in the silence between the actions. The arrest wasn't just a physical moment. It was the final act of a play that had been building for months. They took him back to the station, where the questions would start again, where his silence would fill the room. There were no words, no confession, just the soft click of a door closing behind him. Outside the station, the town had already begun to gather. It was still early, but people were standing in clusters outside the small brick building. Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, friends who had been there from the beginning, waiting for news. They would not get it that morning. Not the way they wanted to, not the way they had hoped. Instead, they would wait in their cars, hoping for an answer, hoping for something that could ease the ache that had lasted for months. The arrest was a moment, a finality in the case, but it was not the end. The trial was yet to come. The pieces were still falling into place. And for Kohberger, this was just the beginning of a long road ahead. A road that would stretch across courtrooms and media coverage. A road that would define him forever. The interrogation room was sterile. Cold fluorescent lights buzzed above. A table stood in the center. 2 chairs across from each other, one empty, one occupied by Bryan Kohberger, his back straight, his eyes focused on the wall in front of him. He didn't blink when the door opened. He didn't flinch when they sat down across from him. Detective Thompson spoke first. A calm voice, measured. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The one where the silence would break. The one where the truth would finally spill out. But Kohberger remained silent. His fingers tapped slowly on the table. He glanced down once, then looked up again, his gaze fixed but distant, as if he were somewhere else. As if he were not in the room with the detectives, not in the middle of an interrogation. "Bryan, we know what happened that night," Thompson said, his voice low. "I know you do," Kohberger replied. But it wasn't a confession. It wasn't an admission. It was a statement that hung in the air and left the room feeling colder. They tried again, pressed harder this time, asking for the details, the why, the how. The moment when it all went wrong, Kohberger answered in fragments. He spoke about his background, his studies, his life at Washington State University, but nothing about the murders, nothing about the victims, nothing about the night that had turned everything upside down. They asked him about the car, about the white Hyundai Elantra, the one that had been seen near the scene. They asked about the DNA, the evidence that tied him to the crime, the blood found on the knife sheath, the fibers found in the car. He said nothing. He didn't deny it, but he didn't confess. He simply sat there, watching them, as if the weight of their words had no effect on him. Detective Thompson leaned forward. "Bryan, it's over," he said. "We have the evidence. We have everything we need." Kohberger didn't respond. He only shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping again on the table. The sound felt like a clock ticking toward an inevitable moment. A moment where the truth could not remain hidden any longer. But the moment never came. Kohberger's silence remained unbroken. They pressed on for hours, trying different angles, trying to crack the cold exterior. But it never happened. They left the room to regroup, left Kohberger alone for a while. When they returned, he still said nothing. No confession, no explanation. The silence in the room felt suffocating, like a fog that couldn't be lifted. Kohberger knew they had the evidence. He knew the case was closing in on him. But he didn't speak. He didn't offer any answer that would explain the bodies found on King Road. His silence was his only defense, and it held steady. The interrogation ended without a confession. No tears, no remorse, no why that could explain what had been done. And for the detectives, the frustration lingered. They knew the case wasn't over. Not yet, but they also knew that some truths take longer to reveal. The courthouse stood like an old sentinel at the edge of the town. It had witnessed years of cases, of verdicts and judgments and moments that shaped the lives of those who passed through its doors. But this time something felt different. This time the air inside the courthouse was thick with anticipation. Every corner seemed to hold a breath that no one dared to exhale. Bryan Kohberger walked into the courtroom in handcuffs. His face was calm, but his eyes told a different story. The eyes that had remained silent in the interrogation room now seemed to be searching for something. For someone, maybe for a way out. Maybe for a shred of the control he had lost over the last few months. He was led to the defendant's table, where he sat without speaking. His shoulders hunched slightly, as if he could shrink into the chair and disappear. But there was no place to hide here. The spotlight was on him, and the world was watching. The families were already seated in the gallery, some with their heads bowed, others with their eyes fixed on the man who had taken their loved ones. There were no tears yet, just quiet faces waiting for the story to unfold, waiting for answers. The prosecution was ready. They had spent months preparing for this moment. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every witness had been gathered and laid out. They had the DNA, they had the car, they had the surveillance footage. They had everything they needed. But it would still take time to make the case. And time was something the families had run out of. The defense sat quietly. Their job was simple: to defend their client, to question the evidence, to find doubt in the facts. But even they knew this was a case where doubt was hard to come by. The judge called the room to order, and the trial began. The prosecutor stood first. They spoke with calm authority. They spoke of the victims, their lives, their hopes, their dreams. They spoke of the night when everything was taken from them. And they spoke of Bryan Kohberger as the one who had ended it all. They walked the jury through the timeline. They showed the phone records, the car sightings, the DNA match that had sealed the case. They explained how each piece of evidence fit together like a puzzle, how Kohberger's presence at the crime scene could no longer be denied. The defense, when it was their turn, questioned the evidence. They asked if the DNA could have been planted. They asked if the car could have been mistaken. They questioned the reliability of the phone records. They did everything they could to plant a seed of doubt. But no matter how hard they tried, the truth seemed to shine through the cracks. The jury sat quietly, listening. Each piece of evidence weighed in their minds, each argument considered, but in their hearts, they knew what the prosecution had laid out. It was clear. It was undeniable. Bryan Kohberger was the one who had killed those students. But the trial wasn't over. Not yet. There would be more testimony, more evidence, more moments when the truth would come into focus. And as the day ended, the families left the courtroom quietly, some with their heads held high, some with tears in their eyes, but all of them holding on to the hope that justice would be served. The trial continued, but the courtroom grew quieter as the days passed. Each piece of evidence weighed heavier on the hearts of those who came to witness. The families who had lost so much sat in the same rows, day after day. They did not speak to the cameras. They did not respond to the reporters outside. They simply waited, as they had waited for months, for the man who had taken everything to face justice. It was never just about the facts. Not for them. The DNA, the car, the timeline. They understood all of it. But there was one thing they could never understand. One thing that would never make sense. Why? Why their children? Why their loved ones? Why did this happen? Each mother who entered the courtroom wore the same expression. It wasn't just grief. It was a quiet ache, deep and unyielding. The kind of pain that doesn't fade with time. The kind of pain that asks questions that have no answers. The fathers sat still, their hands resting on their laps or on the armrests of their chairs. They had no words to offer. They had no answers either. All they could do was watch. Watch the trial unfold and wait for something to change. For something to make sense again. And Kohberger, sitting at the defendant's table, his eyes never strayed to the families. His silence never wavered. Not once did he look at the faces of those who sat in front of him. Not once did he seem to feel the weight of their grief. He only sat there, stoic, like a man waiting for a train that would never arrive. Somehow that silence made the family's grief worse. He was a man who had taken everything from them, and he would never offer them anything in return. No apology, no explanation, no closure. The prosecution continued to build their case. They painted a picture of a man who had walked through the world unnoticed, who had moved through life in a quiet, calculated way. And yet none of that explained why he had done what he did. None of it explained why he had taken 4 young lives on a cold November night. Was it revenge? Was it a random act of violence? Had he known them? Had he watched them? Had he waited for the perfect moment? The defense pushed back, of course. They argued the evidence was circumstantial. They asked for leniency, for understanding. They said Kohberger was not a monster, but a man who had made a terrible mistake. But even they knew, deep down, that no one would buy that story. Not now. Not after everything that had been laid bare in the courtroom. The families continued to sit quietly, day after day. Some took notes. Some held each other's hands. Some simply stared at the floor. They did not want to be there, but they knew they had no choice. This was the only way to bring the man who had taken so much to justice. When the day ended, they filed out of the courtroom, one by one, their faces tired but resolute. They would not leave without an answer, no matter how long it took. But the answer they wanted was still far away, still locked in the silence of the man in the gray suit. The man who had no words for them. The trial had ended. The verdict had been read, but nothing felt finished. The families still carried the weight of the past year on their shoulders. It was a quiet kind of grief, the kind that follows you even when the noise dies down, even when the world turns its attention elsewhere. For them, nothing would ever go back to normal. The empty chairs at the table, the silent phone calls, the empty rooms that once echoed with laughter, the void that no one could fill. Kohberger had been sentenced to life in prison without parole. The jury had spoken. The judge had given his words. But none of that took away the pain. None of it brought back what had been taken. The families went home. Some moved across the country. Some stayed close to the places that had once been so full of life. But none of them could escape the shadow that hung over them. The shadow of a man who had walked into their lives and taken their children away. Without explanation. Without reason. And the town of Moscow went back to its rhythm. But the quiet was different now. It was not peaceful. It was heavy. The town had learned to live with its grief, but it would never forget. Years would pass, but the memories would stay. The photographs on the walls, the empty spots at graduation, the birthdays that would never be celebrated again, the words left unspoken. Some survivors of the crime would try to move on. Some would start foundations. Some would raise awareness about the dangers that can lurk in the most familiar places. Others would simply remember in silence. In their own ways, they would carry their loved ones with them, even after all these years. And Bryan Kohberger, he would spend his days behind bars, silent, watching the world go by. A man with no words, a man with no remorse. The trial had been his moment, his final chance to speak. But he had chosen silence. And in the end, his silence was the most powerful thing he gave to the world. What remained now was the legacy of the victims. What remained was the memory of the 4 students who had been full of life, full of promise. What remained was the love of families who would never stop grieving. And what remained was the reminder that some truths cannot be explained, no matter how much we ask. The house on King Road still stood, empty, lonely, a monument to a moment that changed everything. A place that had been filled with laughter and hope and dreams, now forever marked by tragedy. But the stories of those who were lost would never fade. They would live in the hearts of those who loved them, and in the hearts of those who followed their story. Because while justice can take its time, memories last forever. And as long as there are people who remember, the story will never truly end.